tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. As we've touched on many times in this group, and many teachers touch on this, there's a very long-term conversation in the Buddhist world around the relationship between inner cultivation of states, cultivation of the kind of individually arising insight that is productive of freedom in a very classical sense, insight into impermanence, into the nature of dissatisfaction, into the nature of the self, the uprooting of the tendencies toward grasping and hatred and delusion. And the outward, we say outward, inner and outer are, spatial metaphors, but they feel accurate enough. The outward manifestations of spirit that we may be drawn to in the world that might play out as service, that might play out as, aspects of our livelihood, aspects of our relational life in family and community and culture. They might play out in our political engagements. So there has long been a tension between these. The Buddha himself gets, in some very, relatively minor ways, asked about it, not so directly, not as directly as our modern conversation or postmodern conversation about engaged Buddhism. Later on in Buddhist history, there are threads of conversation around the natural relationship between interior practice and external manifestation. Sometimes these in Buddhist history came up when, not so much for monastics or, in relation to the, the Buddha himself, but when very powerful people would be drawn to the Dharma or would convert to the Buddhist way of life, and in doing so, would take up some of the most central tenets of the Dharma, including nonviolence. So, famously, Emperor Ashoka, a few hundred years after the time of the Buddha, converts and then commits to nonviolence. Sometimes with these kinds of commitments, particularly in China, there were, commitments to vegetarianism coming in, which became very important in Chinese Buddhism, even a defining feature of Chinese Buddhism. There's a famous moment in Tibetan history, in pre-Buddhist or early Buddhist Tibetan history, where Tibet was a very much more extended empire, and Buddhism is beginning to arrive in Tibet, and someone counsels the emperor that if he were to convert and govern the empire under Buddhist standards rather than what had been happening before, that the empire would naturally shrink because it takes constant military activity and violence to maintain an extended empire. And the empire was, and that's exactly what happened. The emperor was sufficiently, converted, enamored, drawn into faith in the Dhamma, the Dharma, that he did pull back the army and settled into a more a more peaceful kind of governance, which naturally meant a less imperial governance. But for most of Buddhism's history, Buddhist cultures were flourished within monarchies, largely, kingdoms and empires for the first couple thousand years, and and they flourished within systems of patronage, systems of, wealthy folks supporting monasteries and supporting, monks and nuns to practice. In some places, the Buddhist institutions became very interwoven with government, as they still are in Thailand, for instance, and um, uh, and were in Burma up until very recently. Um, where in Thailand, the monastic order is completely interwoven with the monarchy, and the king and the government will make actual decisions about what the monks can or can't do, how the sangha is run, like politically, economically, etc. But all of this is still, I think, in a categorical way, radically different from um, what we find ourselves in now, in a moment where there are these Buddhisms that can be called engaged. Engaged as an adjective to describe a kind of Buddhism is only necessary not just to make a contrast from disengaged, but also when engagement, um, in a certain way, means more than it ever has before. And I think the reason that it means more is that the one of the reasons that engagement is more meaningful now than it ever has been is that engagement in the kind of social and political process is different than it ever has been before. And one of the things that I've been thinking about lately with this is, the relationship of democracy, particularly, to the view or idea that as Dharma practitioners, we can, but perhaps even should, balance the inward and outward expressions of our practice. That there's an inward expression of practice that's meditative and emotional and insightful and wisdom-oriented. And there's an outward expression that is engaged in the social and political situation around us, whether that's locally, like in your town, or nationally in the way that you relate to the large scale movements of your government, or the global movements between governments. Engaged Buddhism becomes possible, or is, I think, inextricable in a way um, from the idea that as people not in formal political power, that we have a place in the political conversation, that we have gestures that we can make that affect the political situation, and that it's important to do so. So, I was thinking about this afternoon, and it's not just in democracies that this is the case, but I was thinking about, Marx's very famous line about, religion being the opiate of the people. This way that religion, he's primarily thinking of, the Judeo-Christian religions, but religion being a kind of framework or a view framework that turns our attention toward the transcendent, whatever that is for the particular religion. So, religion in a way as an answer to the problem of suffering, turning our attention toward that which is a deeper relief of suffering than anything we can find through manipulating material conditions, here on the ground. And so, it being an opiate, like a numbing agent, people unable to affect their material conditions because they're disempowered politically, turn to a story, a narrative that offers hope of a better tomorrow. To quote a really awesome Kung Fu New Wave movie from the 90s in Hong Kong, speaking of democracy and its end. This way that the religious impulse and Buddhism, whether you can think of it as a religion or not as a religion, but it contains a transcendent impulse in it, right? It contains a view that says there is something beyond the suffering that we experience by getting what we didn't want, not getting what we want, suffering through the conditions that that play on our senses all the time. Right? You can't always attain material comfort or safety. You can't have, the shelter you want, the food you want, the clothing you want, the friendship, partnership, family situation that you want, the protection from danger that your animal being longs for, the protection from danger for those you love or identify with, your tribe, your people, your community, your culture, or everyone. You can't have that, right? This is dukkha. This is that profound dissatisfaction. Dissatisfaction isn't the right word, I think, for dukkha. It makes it feel too like I have a preference. Oh, I wish things were nicer. I'm unsatisfied. Dukkha, I think, is much deeper than dissatisfaction. I'm not yet ready to re-embrace the word suffering, but there's something actually more profound than that, especially when it gets onto this kind of existential level where you really understand that the nature of the world is that you will be denied the fullness you seek. You will be denied the safety or refuge that you seek. At the very best, it will be it will be given you with a kind of fragility or instability at its core. You can have it, you can be privileged, you can be well cared for, you can be loved, you can be wealthy for a little while, and then it's gone. And the Buddha gets this. And so, unlike the heaven-based religions, the Buddha comes in with what I think is a marvelous and altogether more radical idea that there is no escape from this other than to uproot it completely from the heart. There's no place to go. There's no heaven to go where you are still essentially you, but protected from suffering forever by being in the presence of the divine. That is a story that's deeply compelling, right? The Buddha might say that heaven-based religions are a kind of opiate in a certain way, but or at least they don't go far enough. They don't understand that it's not possible to still be you and be in a kind of eternally protected heaven. That the thing that is eternally protecting has to involve losing that thing that you're trying to protect, the you that is at the heart of this experience. But it's still a transcendent narrative, the Buddhist narrative. It says it's possible to do something that brings you beyond this crushing feeling while still living in it. The magic of the marvelousness, the brilliance, I think, of the Buddhist transcendence is that it happens while you're alive, not after you're dead. It's not the Christian heaven that you only get to after you die. That's a really good story for creating martyrs, because you're happier to die, because you're going to the good place. Buddhism denies you that. It's, kind of heartbreaking in that way, but it promises something else that's extraordinary in a completely different way, which is that this liberation of heart happens while you're alive, and you can actually live it, live with it, live through it. But there's an aspect then of the Buddhist story that in a certain way depends on us really getting in a visceral way that dukkha is unavoidable. That there's no way to actually kind of solve samsara so that we can live here in peace and justice and, the American way, happily. The Buddha lived under in countries that were, some of them were kind of like feudal, family-based sort of feudal republics. Some of them were kind of straight up early monarchies, like city-state kind of areas, feudal city-states. And there were the beginnings of a couple small empires. The Buddha never said that there was a path there where you would overthrow an unjust king and set up a better society. Nobody said that in that time. That wasn't part of Confucius. That wasn't part of, um, the closest anyone came to proposing this was to imagine an ideal that was impossible. So the Buddha imagines the wheel-turning king, a deeply ethical, profoundly enlightened monarch who's still a singular monarch, but you can trust them because they're enlightened. Socrates through Plato proposes essentially the same thing, the philosopher king, again, one enlightened despot. None of these folks propose democracy per se, and of course, famously, Athenian democracy is really a certain kind of oligarchy. Like, it's a very tiny number of landowning men only. It doesn't include most people that are there. The Buddha doesn't ever suggest and much that we would call activism at all, like to try to change the social situation around him. What he does that is radical is he creates an alternative society. So he essentially says you can't change the governance of folks who have different worldviews than you, right? But what you can do is you can gather people together who share a worldview. For instance, a worldview that holds values like non-harming and non-stealing and generosity and kindness, non-cruelty, honesty, etc., at their heart. He says you can take these qualities that the wheel-turning monarch would manifest, and you can make a smaller kind of intentional community with very strict rules, for who's in it and who's out, who's not in it, and how it's governed. And it's a lot of hard work to create that. Like, you have to create a whole legal system to do it, but you can do that, and that's a way to live together in a way that is just and more peaceful. And so he creates the Sangha of ordained monastics and those who support them as his radical social vision. This is where the Buddha puts his energy. He doesn't try to change the empire to be more just, sort of. He kind of does, but he mostly doesn't. He mostly creates his alternative. The way that he does is not by trying to, convince the rulers to be more ethical per se. One of the main ways that he does is he tries to convert them. So he converts several local kings to the Dharma. And he's depending on there being a kind of downstream effect that when the king, like the Tibetan king who converted, who then becomes, more nonviolent, more generous. And the Buddha does teach kings his principles for a healthy society, which include, for instance, income redistribution. He says to a king, the cause of crime is poverty. If you want to decrease crime, use your tax revenues to support the poor and the working class, essentially, and merchants to do their thing. Once you give money away, to support people. When people are not struggling in poverty, there won't be crime. This is the Buddha's kind of fundamentally, essentially, sort of proto-socialist, structure for social well-being. So his activism is there in him trying to teach kings how to do this, how to care for their realms in an ethical way. But the primary way that it manifests is in his formation of this alternate society of the Sangha. We flash forward, a couple thousand years and change, and we start to get a very different idea, growing initially in Europe and then spreading globally. And we're now fully immersed in this worldview that, has a lot of variations, but partly is called democracy. The idea arises that people, and initially, again, a very small collection of people, and then, slowly growing in suffrage over the centuries, and very imperfectly and still quite imperfectly manifested everywhere that it's attempted, but we're working on it. That people can do well when given the ability to have a say in their governance, to choose those who govern them, to choose the laws that govern them, to choose representatives to govern them. You all could think of 100 examples for when this goes poorly, and we are living in the middle of some of them right now. But you can also all probably think of 100 examples of ways that this has gone well, and layers of freedom and justice that have unfolded in democratic countries that were never dreamed of underneath monarchies and empires, because, when given the power to do so, people tend to advocate for peace and security and well-being for themselves and each other, and for a peaceful, life for themselves and their families and their communities. But if we think about this idea of democracy up against the core principles of the Dharma, there may be some tensions that arise. And I think one of those tensions is around this core idea of dukkha, that if we introduce into our psyche collectively the idea that political action is possible and it's a way to improve the conditions of safety and refuge and security and well-being for people, and that it's actually possible to do so, I think, first of all, it pulls, because it's actually more possible now to do so than it was in the past, it makes it, it brings it to the center of ordinary folks' lives in a way that in a non-democratic, society, it isn't as much. I wonder then if it actually weakens the argument toward transcendence, if it actually weakens the argument toward liberation, if we become convinced that through social and political action we can improve our circumstances, does that pull some energy away from the impulse toward liberation from all forms of birth, all forms of grasping, essentially because we've been told that grasping at some things could actually be really bear fruit, right? Grasping at an ideal of justice, it could actually work, that we improve the situation for ourselves and many of those we care about by fighting for justice, by fighting for this abstraction, rather than saying it's just the nature of samsara to be greed, hatred, and delusion run rampant. Therefore, the thing that I can do is liberate my own heart. Now we've arrived at a moment in history where it's actually possible in so many ways for people to come together and change the material and social conditions for those around us in significant ways. And so then we learn that that's possible. We learn that it's good to do so. We believe that it's good to do so. It feels good to do so. First of all, does that change how we relate to ideas of liberation? But also, does it change how we relate to this dialectic of like inner and outer? engaged Buddhism appears, you know, it it appears within uh, the era where democracy is now assumed, because now you actually get to make a choice. Are you going to spend a lot of your time and energy engaged in social and political change, or are you going to spend your time and energy engaged in internal, you know, concentration and insight kind of change? You actually get to choose this now, differently than in times past. It's always been the case that, practitioners get to choose, do you want to spend more of your time and energy on your business or your family or, whatever it is, or on inner cultivation. But I think the idea in a democratic era, in the modern era, so since about the European Enlightenment, let's say, the idea, since the English, but more dramatically since the French Revolution, probably, and the American Revolution, the idea that you can actually just change your state. There's the pun for you, right? Are you working on changing your state or changing the state, right? Now that you can actually change the state, should you? Is that the best use of your energy? So we're in a moment in the United States where the state is changing around us more dramatically than ever in my lifetime. And it, and I'm one who feels in many ways the imperative to stay awake to and connected to and active in this state change on the national level, connected to the rightness of staying informed about what's happening and how it's happening, and supporting communities that are being threatened, in so many ways. And there's a way that, the very real nature of both democracy and just social engagement broadly, that you can be engaged in protest and activism and a million way service in endless ways now, and in political change, all day every day with your energy, if you have that to spare. It creates for us, I think, a new problem or challenge in practice if we retain a connection to the inner cultivation work. Certainly there's the thing that we talk about a lot of, like, how are you balancing your time and energy? Am I balancing the energy that I'm giving to internal cultivation and external service? But more than that, I'm curious about how the potential for successful external change, which is never complete, right? The activist project or the revolutionary project or the civic project is never complete, right? That the fight is just ongoing. If it's a fight, whatever it is, the project of, building a better society, it's ongoing forever. Then how do we conceive of or feel on an energetic level the relationship between the desire for liberation from suffering that traditionally would manifest in practices that lean toward letting go, setting down, resolving grasping in the heart, and the work that we might at the very same time be completely committed to, of staying in the fight, you know, for a better world and a better civic culture for all sorts of people that we care about. And to just feel this kind of dynamic, vibrating tension between those modes of being differently now than ever before in Buddhist history, because of the nature of the societies we live in, and the nature of the activist psyche and the politically participatory psyche now from before. I'm wondering if there's anything more. I think mostly what I just said is that I can really feel a tension there, and it's a tension not just about the rightness of engagement or the rightness of inner practice. I feel the rightness of both, but it's really a tension in the limb of right view. What is our view of the nature of this birth that we've come into, and the nature of the refuge that we've been drawn to in being drawn to the Dharma? I'll close with, I'm not actually sure where to close that one. So this is a moment where, like, internally what I'm doing is I'm reaching for the aspect of the Dharma that can resolve the dialectic. And for me, like, maybe that's, Kuan Yin and active compassion. Sometimes it's, radical kind of dependent origination and profound interconnectedness, selfless, not self, leading to, equanimity-based action without grasping. Those are sort of, those are places where I might find myself wanting to take a stand. And so I offer each of those, and they feel slippery to me in this moment, almost metaphysically slippery. And when I say the words "take a stand," the thing that I actually remember back to, if you were with us last, whatever it was, April, May, when we were in the beginning of the perfection of wisdom in 8,000 words, and the Buddha says, bodhisattvas do not take a stand anywhere. And throughout, I called the writing I was doing earlier today "Democracy and Doubt," because essentially what this stirs up is a form of the hindrance of doubt, skeptical doubt, vicikiccha. And I think part of the basis of that doubt is that it's the moment, for many folks that I know, and I'm certainly in this, the moment is just uncomfortable. The moment in this country is profoundly uncomfortable, and I want to take a stand in something that will make me feel better. Like, I want to feel either my refuge in the Dhamma as like being like, I've got this, and that is the anchor around which the chaos swirls, or I want to take a refuge in an ideal of, justice and the rightness that I and those who believe in, the democratic process are standing for and trying to fight for. Clarity of the rule of law here, and not slide into fascism, all of the things, what's happening. And that also slips away. and the two vibrate next to each other in a kind of uh, you know, itself kind of uncomfortable buzz. So at this moment, I'm comforted almost only by the fact that we're trying to talk about it together, and by this line that that bodhisattvas don't take a stand anywhere, and and I wonder what that might mean, to not actually give up on either on any aspect of this dilemma, to not give up on the country, which I often just want to do, and to not give up on the transcendent promise of the Dhamma, which I also sometimes want to do, and to live with the not giving up on either of those things in a way that leaves me uh, between the two, somewhat unmoored, even as I want to, I want to like retire back into the corner of the Dhamma, into the cave of the Dhamma, and say that, everything is understood within the framework of the Dhamma. And while my heart believes that profoundly, what I'm doing is I'm in that, and I'm holding just the pain, I think, and the profound chaos of what's unfolding in the world that is samsara. And, mostly all I know is that I want people to be protected. I don't want the harm that seems to be unfolding to really to unfold into further harm. So that's the stand I have for tonight. Thanks for reflecting on that with me, and just being open to the finding the winding path in this moment together. Hi, thanks for joining us for this talk and practice. If these recordings are helpful for you, please consider supporting the Sangha with a donation of any amount. You can find links to our website and the donation page below in the description. Liking and subscribing helps the channel, and I'm grateful for your presence, your practice, and anything you can give to support our little community. Thank you so much. Take care.